Welcome everyone to this event sponsored by the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. My name is Paul Elie. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, an author, and through the president's office at Georgetown, I host and help convene the Faith and Culture Conversation Series, which is a series of conversations with writers, artists whose work engages with religious faith in some way or at some point. And it was in connection with that series and with Jesuit Heritage Month a couple of years ago that we had as our guest Lawrence Joseph. And for that event, Larry and I, who have had a conversation about things Jesuit for years and years, drew some connections between his work and his Jesuit education and what we do at Georgetown having to do with Jesuit identity. In some respects, this conversation picks up on that conversation and I hope furthers it in light of the publication of Lawrence Joseph's selected poems with certain clarity. At the same time, this conversation carries on a conversation that he and I have had for a couple of decades, generally walking around downtown Manhattan after a strong cup of coffee and talking along the way. And it fills in or replaces a conversation that we hope to have at the outstanding New York bookstore at McNally Jackson on April 1st of this year. McNally Jackson and our common publisher, Farrar, Straus & Giroux, had arranged a book launch event for the publication of Joseph's selected poems, Certain Clarity. And we were going to have an onstage conversation. Then events intervened, but we have now the opportunity to have that conversation here via Zoom, thanks to Georgetown and the Berkley Center. So first of all, before I welcome you back, Larry, and I'm eager to do that, I'll just introduce you by giving your bio. You're the grandson of Lebanese and Syrian Catholic immigrants, born and raised in Detroit, educated at UD, University of Detroit. That's the Jesuit high school, one of two I now know in Detroit, and graduated from the University of Michigan, from Cambridge, and then from the University of Michigan Law School. This is your sixth book of poetry, 5 standalone volumes, and now the selected, and then a book of prose, Lawyerland, which you and I worked closely on together, really conversation as literature involving lawyers in downtown Manhattan. And then a book of your essays called The Game Changed. You are, and you're completing your term as the Tinnelly Professor of Law at St. John's, the University School of Law, and you've also taught creative writing at Princeton. Nancy Van Gotham, a painter, the two of you have been married and been artists together for, I guess, half a century in Detroit and now in New York. And her way of seeing things figures into your work in more ways than I can say. So welcome, Larry. Welcome back.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate being back. It's good to be back. And, I'm really very pleased we were able to have this conversation and even by Zoom, but also for Georgetown doing it.
I remember when we spoke at Riggs Library a couple of years ago, in the audience that day was Father John Langan, Jesuit, who, as I recall, was educated at UD High. And Father Langan passed earlier this year, and so I have him in mind, and I'd just like to call out to his memory as we begin our conversation, because he was a very significant presence at Georgetown and in the audience of the Faith and Culture series really over the entire time that I've been involved. So Father Langan, you're in mind. Thank you
for doing that, Paul. I knew John. I had met him back in the 80s, actually. And he's a wonderful man, and also a graduate of UD Jesuit, which I share, and his commitment and involvement, his life involvement with not only the Jesuits, but with UD Jesuit. The involvement with UD Jesuit is one that's shared among all the graduates from UD Jesuit. So I'm glad that you're doing this.
When you and I met in 1993, we were introduced by our editor, Jonathan Galassi, who said that we had to talk because of the Catholic connection. That meant three things for me as a person in a position to learn from you all at once. I learned that you and I both speak Jesuit. I learned about the communion of saints, a doctrine that was the subject of an essay you wrote for an anthology I put together called A Tremor of Bliss. And that doctrine, which is so central to your upbringing and to the preconciliar Catholicism that you got in Detroit, had been, let's say, in abeyance in my suburban Catholic childhood. So through that essay and through our conversations about it, you kind of plugged me into that aspect of the Catholic tradition that then became extraordinarily vital in my first book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which is about the invisible connections that bind people to one another across time and across generations and even across cultures. And then there's the sense, and this is the sense that carries forward into the present, through our conversations, I've understood what it means to have the Catholic imagination, especially as it focuses on current events and on history. Of course, people I've read and people I've studied with have that historically inflected Catholic imagination, but I've gotten an especially intense experience of it through our encounters. So based on all that I've just said, what does it mean to speak Jesuit, and what is that inheritance or that part of your shaping experience? What has it meant to you?
Well, it's, I was born Catholic and from a generations of Catholics. My grandparents immigrated to the United States in the early 20th century. My parents were born here. They were all educated in parochial grade schools and high school, as I was.
And they immigrated from where?
From Lebanon and Syria, and Catholics, Eastern Rite Catholics. But my parents and my siblings and cousins, we were all educated in Roman Catholic parochial high schools, grade schools and high schools. And so when I went to UD Jesuit, my older brother and my older cousin had been there. They were the first to go there of our generation. My parents didn't go to college. We were just so fortunate to have them. The importance of education at the highest level was just integral to our upbringing. And by our, I mean even extending to my 24 first cousins, who all went to parochial high school, grade schools, and high schools. And so the Jesuits, UD Jesuit was the only Jesuit high school in Detroit. And it was prominent, and in terms of secondary education, it was among the best high schools in the state of Michigan. And then it was the introduction to the Jesuits. And the strongest thing about the Jesuits is at least in the sort of essence of what I think anyone who studies with is fortunate enough to have the Jesuits educate them, is the importance of the mind, first of all, and then it's infused with the moral fervor of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and that combination of the importance of the mind and the value of the mind, taught by Jesuit scholastics when I was in high school, who came from lower middle class backgrounds. James Joyce once said the Jesuits, sort of one of the things about the Jesuits is give me the students when they're young, and then we'll teach them. And he always said that he came from a lower middle class background, and he said that the Jesuits gave him the education of the upper classes, and that's exactly right. And so just in terms of that and the fervor, and this was happening in Detroit when I was in high school. I started in 1962. My freshman year at UD Jesuit was the Cuban crisis. We had Vatican II being implemented while I was in high school. And then I graduated in 66. The racial tension in Detroit was very high in the 60s. And then it exploded in 1967, the year after I had graduated, and I was at Michigan at that point.
In connection with all this, and this is, I'm eager to get to the new book and to the things that have been said about it, but in our conversations about Catholic Detroit, you always mention the presence or the legacy or the aftertaste of Father Charles Coughlin. What did that mean to you as a young Catholic, Maronite Catholic growing up in Detroit, knowing that? Can you explain who Coughlin was and what his presence was there?
My parents moved to the Coughlin was at the pastor of the Shrine of the Little Flower, which we moved to that parish when I was 3.5 years old or so. And I went to grade school at the Shrine. And so Coughlin by that point had been relegated, if that's the right word, basically by Rome.
After what? I mean, many people don't know his story.
Coughlin, I suspect almost everybody listening to this knows something about Coughlin, because Coughlin hasn't disappeared from the public eye. Coughlin began, well, first of all, he was the first person in the world to utilize the radio with a large audience.
Catholic priest who had weekly broadcasts,
and
right?
He built then a church based on this, with a tower, and then he would broadcast from the tower. And he had the complete support of his bishop, and he preached the social encyclicals, the Leo the 13th, and then the Pius XI social encyclicals. And he backed Roosevelt, and he was important in Roosevelt's victory because of his enormous audience. And Roosevelt learned about the radio from Coughlin, and so did Hitler, because Coughlin was really the first to do it. And they had the technology out of Detroit, because Detroit was the technological center of the world in the 1910s and 1920s. And then he later shifted into a kind of a corporatist, Catholic corporatist fascism, really. And this is part of American history, and too intricate to go into now. And that was in the mid 30s until the early 40s, when he was basically silenced by Rome, and that's an interesting history. And then he returned to the parish. So this would have been, and so 10 years or so later, when I began grade school there. And he would I served mass for him, like many of us did. We lived very close to the shrine. My parents basically moved there for the school. It was largest in the Archdiocese of Detroit. Sisters of Charity. And Coughlin was this kind of distant figure. We knew, and this is mostly through my older brother, who has a very strong historical sense. We knew of Coughlin as a historical figure, and we're aware of that. My parents I've never heard my parents, Coughlin was anti-Semitic, famously so, viciously so. But I never heard my parents utter an anti-Semitic or racist word, ever. And,
just so striking to me that your poetry, it deals with power and its abuses. It deals with the religious realm and how that runs into power, also for good and for ill. And to know that there was this foundational experience, that so many of the themes that show up in your work show up in the story that you just told. I don't want to overemphasize the connection, but it's there if I read your work, that this is something.
Certainly part of it. He's certainly a part of the kind of persons who come into my poetry. I mean, presidents come in, attorneys general come in, commissars come in. Bertolt Brecht comes in, poets come in. So there's people in my poems, and then all the people from family and on the streets in Detroit, etc. So Coughlin's is a character, if you like, in this. But yeah, the impact was formidable to be, first of all, in the presence of and having an historical imagination, over and above being Catholic, just interested in history, which my father was always interested in, always family histories. They're constantly talking about family histories and stories. But Coughlin was representative of a larger story, not only in Detroit and Michigan and but in America, but actually went into the fascist movement. It was very similar to a Franco phalangist. In retrospect, I see that. And now we have a surfacing of a kind of corporate statist Catholicism in the government, which is apparent to every Catholic who isn't part of that and doesn't think that way. And so the instruction, if you like, that Coughlin gave me, witnessing Coughlin, is quite relevant to the way I think about the world and think about power. He lusted for power, and he liked political power.
And as you say, we're seeing the nexus of Catholicism and power in Washington and elsewhere in ways that it's been arrested a bit by the pandemic, but who knows where it's going. And I would say that it doesn't look like it's going to places that are congenial to the gospel or to Pope Francis' vision of the church.
Yeah. Coughlin, if I could just add one other thing, Tom Hayden, who founded SDS, was also went to grade school at the Shrine. He was 7 years older than I was, and Irish Catholic. And then he went to a public high school, and then he went to Michigan, and then he was on the Michigan Daily. But he also founded SDS on the Port Huron Statement, which, if you read it was written by Hayden, Irish Catholic, about unions, Detroit.
This is really the manifesto for the 60s left.
It was the beginning of it. The SDS went all sorts of places, but you read that document from the early 1960s by Hayden, and you see and Hayden acknowledged Coughlin. He said, of course he was aware he grew up in the parish of Coughlin, and Hayden's politics are very different than and I think he took the very same kind of lessons from Coughlin or similar lessons that I was able to take.
Many of these connections are put together in a richly detailed profile by Anthony Domestico in Commonweal that ran a couple of months ago. The biographical connections, the connection between law, religion, New York, Detroit, power, money, your background, Lebanese and Maronite background. All these things are brought together there in this profile that was published on an occasion of your selected poems, a certain clarity. The book has gotten extraordinary reviews. All the materials that I've sent out about it, I can't resist quoting Paul Franz in the New York Times Book Review, a major work of American art. Can't get any better than that. Domestico, in his profile, said about your poems that they register the workings of American power in all its forms. And the poet and critic Michael Hoffman in the London Review of Books proposes that the new book brings together 5 books of your stark and beautiful poems. Congratulations on those reviews.
Thank you.
Those of us who have some knowledge of the publishing world understand how significant it is that those reviews not only came, but came right on publication. People have been waiting for this consolidation of your work. Will you read a poem before we discuss the selected poems?
Yeah, thank you. This is a poem that was written after 9/11. It's in my book, Into It. Unyieldingly present. Near the curb beside the police lines, a pool of blood. The gas tanks of the cars in the garage on West Street exploding. An air tank, its out of air alarm going off, pops and is skidding. That woman staring into space, her dress on fire. What transpires in a second? On an intact floor, a globe of the world bursts like a balloon. A ceiling-mounted exit sign is melting. Facile equivalences are to be avoided. Hell, the horrific, into the routine. Glass and metal can be identified, not the atoms of human ash. I set down thoughts, sequences of images, of emotions, dissolved in a mass, encoded in the brain. The depth or the width of the hatred measured from so high up, the time it takes for those who are falling. Is it that reality, disjointed, cannot be discerned, or that consciousness, disjointed, cannot discern it? The message I am communicating, this beam of focused energy. No, I said, no, I am not going to allow anything to happen to you. I summon up in my mind a place where my thoughts will find yours. No, nothing is going to happen to you. An issue of language now, isn't it? There are these vicious circles of accumulated causation. Irreal is the word. I know of no defense against those addicted to death. God, my God, I thought it was over. Absolutely had to be. What am I supposed to feel? Images that after that loop in the head. Looming ahead in the smoke, that man at the railing can't breathe. I'm having trouble breathing, he says. You saw it? I saw it. I'm frightened. This is about which states of mind? Solid brown and gray, a muddy mass of debris, of powder. There's a strip of window glazing hanging from what kind of a tree? What isn't separated? What isn't scribbled? What will not be metamorphosed, reduced, occurring, it will be said, unyieldingly fixed, unyieldingly present.
I know of no defense against those addicted to death. That line reminds me of a line that came out of the mouth of another poet. On the day the World Trade Center was destroyed, I was at our apartment in the East Village, and the phone rang, and it was Les Murray, the Catholic poet from Australia. And morning in New York is evening in New South Wales. He phoned to make sure that we were all right. And we were. And he said, if they bloody well are willing to kill themselves, there's not a lot you can do about it. Like essentially what this line says, I know of no defense against those addicted to death. So while I was taking that call, you were downtown and you were, if I understand it right, forming that place in your mind where your thoughts would find Nancy's thoughts, that then became this piece of documentary poetry that's also a love poem in a way. Can you explain?
Yeah, what happened on the morning of 9/11, we lived very close to what was ground zero. We still live close to it. And our apartment faces the Hudson River and the harbor, and it's high up. And I went out to St. John's that morning. And then when I got out to St. John's, I found out that that the World Trade Center first tower, the planes had hit, and nothing had happened. That tower hadn't fallen yet, and the second plane hadn't hit. And I went up to my office and I called Nancy, and I got her on the phone, and she had been out on the street voting, actually, and then she came back to the apartment, and I told her to stay in the apartment because we had experienced the bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center, which was close by to where we lived. And we remember that day well. That had been pretty much forgotten by 2001, as if it didn't happen. And then then I went downstairs and there's a television, and I watched the tower, a second plane hit, and and the tower fell, and the towers fell. And then I tried to call again. I think I'd called one time in between, and there was no answer. And so I didn't know, and I knew what happened, but she didn't know what had happened. All she knew was because all the power went out. She had television up to that point. But when the dust went into the air and whatever, she was watching this, and of course horrified, terrorized, and felt that this was like a nuclear war. This was what was happening. And I was out in Queens, and then I fortunately was able to stay with a colleague of mine at their house in Queens. And the next morning, couldn't contact Nancy. There was no communication by anything, by phone. And all the phone stuff was out. And then I went down the next morning, and I managed to get, after, it wasn't easy, but I managed to get down here. And with a policeman on the back of his scooter. And there was nobody down here except this was the morning after, and right a block away. And I finally got up to the apartment, and then Nancy and I, we put together stuff. And the only subway running was from downtown was the F train over near Seward Park and East Broadway. And we walked there with our bags, whatever was necessary. And then we took the train out, and then we were evacuated for several weeks before we could go back. And so that
go ahead. So in the middle of all this, this is a poem, the beauty of its structure and the naturalness, I suppose, of it, the waves of sensory detail having to do with the blast and the aftermath, and then pocketed in within it is this attempt to communicate through the imagination with your wife. The message I am communicating, this beam of focused energy. No, I said, no, I'm not going to allow anything to happen to you. I summon up in my mind a place where my thoughts will find yours. No, nothing is going to happen to you.
But if someone doesn't know the biography, my biography of that and is reading it, certainly there's a biographical dimension to it that certainly contributed to my writing of it. But how many people that morning and during that day were having that very same thought in Estival? It was that type of connection in times of separation. We've got people now in on ventilators in hospitals who no one can visit them. And so how are people communicating that love the people that are on ventilators in hospitals because of this virus? They're communicating through the mind, through the imagination. It's a form of prayer, is what it is. And so I bring God in, God, my God. In other words, this is happening. Killers is what we're dealing with, violence and destruction. And then the mind starts to separate out. So it was meant very much not only in its biographical side, which it certainly can be read that way, but also in a more collective sense of those who resist this, who hate this kind of murder and killing. And that's always been the way that I've approached my poetry from the beginning. There's certainly a biographical side, and I use biographical rather than autobiographical because writers never are autobiographical, even when they're writing autobiographies. I mean, they're always there's a fictive side to it always. There are biographical facts that every writer has, and they put that into their work, whatever way they put that into the work. Every writer does it one way or the other. But the poetry has always been interested, let me speak imaginatively. Imaginatively, my imagination and the writing of poems and the traditions of poetry that I come out of, also are imagining larger types of structures, historical structures, power structures. And I have an imagination for this. Where does it come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact in the Catholic side of the belief in the incarnation, where God becomes human and lives in history. And which is, and then you add, an inheritance of this from some family awareness of its histories in Detroit and Lebanon, immigrants, America. So there's always a sense of history, and there are poets who are, deal with history, and I'm among them. But I'm constantly trying to think of where this fits in terms of the times I live.
Right, not just your personal experience.
Yeah, no, I have nothing. I'm not particularly attracted to poetry that's very kind of endlessly self-centered. I don't have any problem with certain poems that are dealing with the self and the interior self and whatever. I have a great deal of language of the interior self in my poetry, all through it. And I have biographical information too, but no, something larger. The poetry that I like and the poetry that sticks with me, and this goes all the way back to ancient poetry and poetries, is always dealing with something larger, very much getting down the realities of a given time that we're living as human beings.
Do you have to think about that on a formal or technical level? So, for example, Michael Hoffman in his review suggested that your poetry answers to now. And the poem that you read, on one level, answers to a collective experience, to a historical moment that many, many, many people felt personally, emotionally implicated in. But now we're in a different, similar historical moment where people feel an urge to respond to the moment with words or in art, but many of those impulses are facile or aren't up to the situation. Do you, as an artist who has made work that answers to now, in some respects, what can you tell us about how it's done or how it's best done?
Well, that's the study of it. I mean, I've always adhered to what Yeats said in one of his last poems, Under Ben Bulben. I think it was his last poem. He's got a section, Irish poets learn your trade and learn your craft. And poets need to learn their craft. And that's what I've done from the beginning of writing it. Subject matter, everybody has subject matter and it writes poetry, and it comes out of their own imaginations, their own experience, whatever. But it's how you put it together. And I also, and that's the forming of it. I'm also very aware of being in traditions of poetry and working out my own tradition and traditions of who I'm answering to, who I'm conversing with. Eugenio Montale talks about poets conversing with other poets across time, generations. In other words, a conversation with Virgil, conversation with Homer, a conversation with Dante, significant conversation on my part with Dante. Conversation being that turning with the literal meaning of it, and fashioning it. And so I see myself very much in these various traditions, and the traditions are broad. My tastes are quite expansive. I mean, I'm not limited in my aesthetic tastes.
You cite in one of the poems Mandelstam's remark about the Commedia, that it's a journey with conversations.
Yeah.
And now you're describing the life of a poet as a kind of journey with conversations.
Well, not every poet would
Conversations
think,
with other
not
poets.
every poet would think of it that way, nor do I think they have to think of it that way. He was talking about Dante, and when I read that, I said, yes, that's exactly what Dante is. It's a journey of conversations. He's got people in the Commedia, and I like that. I like that, and it agrees with my sense. So I'm conversing with Mandelstam, who's conversing with Dante, and then I'm writing a poem.
And here we are in conversation, and we also have an audience. If people who are tuned in through Zoom would like to submit questions, there's the Q&A bar at the bottom, and we'll get to the questions. But first, I'd ask you to read another poem, Larry,
Okay.
as the questions begin to come in.
This is a poem that's toward the end of my most recent book of poems. So where are we? It's entitled "And for the Record." Revelations reoccurring. He who is babbling away in James Madison Plaza, and what goes around, what comes around, light made holy by the fury of the tears with which it mingles. Simple enough when looked at directly, the child, shy and fearful, who won't speak. And for the record, the mind, like the night, has 1,000 eyes. Sparrows in the bushes, a small cat rolls in the snow, sleet pounding the windows. In the space of a memory, the facade of a church, an angel on each side of a fiery wheel.
Thank you. I teach a course at Georgetown called Fiction, Faith, and Violence. And if you pocket it in poetry rather than fiction, that would be a good approximation of some of the themes in your work: poetry, faith, and violence. Here, my question is simple. In the course, I discuss with students again and again as we go through a dozen texts, to what extent is the book in question religious in that it's dealing with religious material, religious imagery, images of churches, such as the one in this poem? And to what extent is it religious in that it reflects a religious outlook or drama going on the part of the author? This poem seems to unfold aspects of both.
Yeah, my work, when I have religious imagery, which goes through it, has aspects of both. And I think that's the way I think about it in terms of my religious sensibility as a poet, because that's what we're talking about in that. And there's another side to it, that from the beginning I'm developing what I call a theological critique. In other words, I've always, especially since I was at UD Jesuit, I was taught theology by one Jesuit in particular who had an enormous effect on me. And then actually there were two of them that did. But I've always had a sense of theological, of God in a theological sense. And so I read theology. I like moral theology a great deal. We've got some terrific moral theologians now that and they're not the ones that I would put on the quote unquote right wing Catholics. I don't find their moral theology moral in most instances, and there's a great deal of for those who are Catholic know this, of the kind of conflict is not, I think, too strong of a word, of what's going on there. But it's part of my imagination, and so it moves in and out of the work.
Both of the questions that have come in have to do with a certain clarity. That's the title of the selected poems. The questions are this. What is the certain clarity that the title refers to? And how did you go about choosing from the 5 books of poems, the poems that would be included in a certain clarity?
Well, certain clarity cuts 2 ways. One, it's a certain clarity, and then it's a
Certain in the sense of
certain in
certain.
the sense of it being certain or sure or whatever. And then it's just a certain kind of clarity. And I mean both of them going through. I think the clarity, at least the clarity that is, there's a number of levels of clarity. One is an aesthetic clarity, the purpose of the writing of the poem, which is important in my work and from the beginning. And I think especially I picked this title for this selected at this point in time. This was before the pandemic, and after Trump had been elected. And when my last book came out before Trump had been elected, he had been elected, but the book was finished before he was elected. Moral clarity, a kind of moral in terms of political morality, of religiously clear clarity. And we need clarity. I found, going back through my poetry, that was a constant kind of refrain, and from the beginning, that wanting to understand, that which is so human, but also very much part of the way that I think. So I would say that the answer to that question is in the book itself. And I put this together as a book. I think of myself as a poet of collected poems. I don't, and I'm very aware of trying to make every poem that I write as perfect as I can. I do some minor revisions, but usually not after the book comes out. But I wanted to put this together as a book in itself. And Jonathan Galassi, my editor, so graciously gave me a good deal of sort of space to do this in, and to make a real generous kind of selection. I left poems out that I would put in if I was developing a different kind of arc, so to speak. But I wanted to focus on the clarity, the need to be clear about the way we think about certain things. I think would be one way of describing it, and and maybe that's the certain clarity. The certain clarity is trying to understand, have clarity. James Joyce talked about clarity all the time.
I seem to remember one of the Beat poets saying something like, "Please God, a little clarity."
Yeah,
I don't remember which one.
I don't know of any, and very few human beings, if they're not evoking God in prayer to give poetry clarity, they're evoking something in them, in the human, to have clarity. Because we get the amount of confusion and lies, just lies in realms of power. In my lifetime, the lives I've experienced in realms of power and people with power, and we need not add what's been added to that. It's just why we speak. And to be able to, another dimension of clarity is truth. In other words, revealing truth, or even more accurately, I would say at this point, not saying anything that's untrue. In other words, trying to make every sentence, every part of what I write in my poetry, not untrue. In other words, something that isn't fake, doesn't add to the fakery, the real fakery that is operating, the detestable, destructive, murderous fakery that we've all been dealing with, and continually are dealing with, and this is what we live in. So
I'd say that during the past few weeks, many people have written or spoken about what they're watching, what they're reading, and some people seem to look for consolation for art from an ordered world that's not like the one we're in right now, and others are looking for art that somehow speaks to the moment. What about you? What are you reading now, and what does it have anything to do with the pandemic, and how?
well, I'm reading literature. I'm watching everything going on. I've always watched everything going on politically, and keeping up on the day to day, because that goes into the poetry and the day to day of what's happening with the virus, for all sorts of reasons, but also to watch what's happening. I went back and read The Plague, by Camus, which I hadn't read in a long time. Camus is an important writer to me.
Back in the 60s, that was really, I mean, you were probably a teenager when you were first reading Camus, right?
No, I didn't read Camus until I was at Cambridge. I was older when I first read Camus, and I was, in Europe, and then I basically studied Camus. I mean, Camus was, but I went back and read The Plague. It was actually Stuart Gilbert's translation, which has been surpassed once and it's going to be surpassed again. And everybody was reading The Plague. Camus kind of came in again. There's been some very good writing, a wonderful piece on the Plague in this issue of the London Review of Books, bringing in a lot of problems with Camus. But Camus, but I got very interested in as many of us have, in prior the plague, literature of the plague, and viruses and epidemics, and so I've gone back and looked at that. Lucretius ends the De Rerum Natura with the plague. He rewrites Thucydides on the plague, and then I like to do research. In other words, I like to find out things so that I can connect together. Kafka had the Spanish flu. Walter Benjamin had the Spanish flu. And so why didn't they write about it or whatever? Well, this was during what? How many people died from 1914 to 1918 in the world? And then, and you also had bacterial infections, and you had no antibiotics, and children were dying.
Following on the Great War, so it's not so surprising that they didn't write about having the Spanish flu.
They were constantly confronted with death at every level in ways that are unimaginable for us, except when we go back and read them. And now the entire world is confronted with death in a way that I certainly haven't been confronted with it on a global level like this, imaginatively. And I think it's very valuable to go back and read those who in the past have had to be confronted with death permeating their lives. Losing children from scarlet fever, epidemics, all pre-antibiotics and penicillin, which was just invented just a couple of years before I was born. Polio, and Salk was in Ann Arbor. I was in kindergarten, and we were the first ones to be tested for it because we were in Michigan. And so polio.
I know, writing about Bach had fathered many children, and let's say 10 of them didn't survive. And the assumption, often when we look back at the past, is that because mortality rates were so high in the past, that people just accepted that. But if you look at the story of Bach, it's quite the opposite is the case. He grieves for every lost child as if it's the only child.
It's all through literature, and it's expressed in Bach and his music. Bach can evoke sorrow and joy, like who is an artist?
But what I'm saying, and trying to connect back to what you said about Benjamin and Kafka, is that the, they were faced with death around every corner. Death was pervasive in that historical moment, but that didn't desensitize them to death. They still, the awfulness and the theft of a life struck people in that moment every single time in ways that we are well to remember.
Camus, or Kafka had tuberculosis, and so did Camus. Now we can deal with tuberculosis. There was an epidemic of it, and so this is something that in my lifetime, and most of our lifetimes, no one has ever experienced this. Certainly not on the global level. Affects virtually everyone on the planet, and so. And writers will respond to it. The immediate responses, I think, are real and important. We're all doing this. We're all thinking about this constantly at one level. But time will pass, and this will be part of history. It'll be a major event in world history. One of them, a singularly major event in world history. And who will record it ultimately? The recording will ultimately be done by writers, by historians, nonfiction writers, by fiction writers, and I think poets can do it the best. Poets have always, in my opinion, been able to do it the best. Homer mentions a plague very early on in the Iliad, in addition to all the other death and the link. Yes.
There's another question, and it has to do with the place of hope in your work. When you work on your poems, how would you describe the process of bringing hope or expressing hope in the poems, and how does that how do you do it in a way that sounds right to your artistic sense and also to your religious sense?
Well, it's very religious. I mean, hope is a religious virtue. It's one of the theological virtues in Catholic theology, and one that I memorized as a theological virtue when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. So it's very much, it's one of the theological virtues. The others are faith and love. And the opposite of hope is despair. And we all feel despair. Opposite of love is hatred. And the opposite of faith is doubt and disbelief. And we all struggle with disbelief. We all struggle with hating. We all struggle with despair. And I think that the in times of despair myself, I never give up hope, but what I do is it's what I believe in. And what I believe in is what I hope for. And who and what I love is what I hope for. And so hope is very intricately involved with me, with faith and love. And it's a period of time, at least for me, and I think it's in the poetry. The sense of what I believe in is very strong in the poetry, and love is very strong in the poetry. And consciously, it's part of who I am. It's part of who I imaginatively am. Is the source of that religious? If it is, and I believe it is, it's a gift. I see it as grace, and that folds into the religious side. Need it be religious? No. I know people who have beliefs, who love, who hope, who don't have a religious sensibility.
Is there an express attempt to work it into the poetry? So, for example, two musicians of our time, of your time, made late works in which they deliberately withheld any lightness or hope. I'm thinking of David Bowie and Leonard Cohen, and the last work was a refusal of hope, and maybe even the suggestion that unbalanced art was the way to go out.
I can't do that.
Try to achieve a kind of
I
balance.
can't do that because faith, hope, and love are combined. They're the same thing. It's like the Trinity. In fact, Augustine in De Trinitate talks about the three, faith, hope, and love, in terms of the Trinity, basically analogical thinking, which he engaged in better than any human being up to that point, and maybe better than any human being since. And so am I going to stop loving? No. No, I'm not going to stop loving. Am I going to stop believing in what I believe in? No. Will I temper it in whatever way I need to do it to remain moral and try to do good? Yeah, that's the real side of it. The impulse to put hope and love and faith into the work is a moral impulse. It's to do good. It's the love includes for me doing good. Faith includes for me doing good. Hope includes for me doing good. And doing good, Toni Morrison said this. She was Catholic, and she never said she wasn't. And she said, that's what you do. She said, writers do language. That's what she said. But she said, as her moral impulse, and she was one of the great moral thinkers in certainly American history and world history. And she said, you do good. That's what you do. And that comes, that's the source of it. If I don't know about David Bowie or Leonard Cohen, but I can't, from the beginning, the impulse of this combination of faith, hope, and love has been in my work from the outset.
When she said that, I was going to quote Aquinas, the art is the good of the thing made, so the poet does good in language. Will you read one last poem before we close out?
Yes,
and
thank you.
let's hear how it's done.
This is a poem that concludes my book, Into It. And it could conclude, I think, a certain clarity, because I think it really could be entitled A Certain Clarity. Once again, the esplanade, high summer. The sea is beyond the sunset's light. The shapes a mast, the sky a current carrying us along, heavy with that green and that black. Fate's precisive wheel revolving, force's writhing wheel, the stealing, the killing, accomplished by new types of half monsters. It's what I said. The poem is the dream, a dream technique, the primary soul substance on which our attention is fixed. Supernal, metaphysical, in other words, a representation, as we have seen, of mythical origins. Something felt, something needed, as much as we needed. A woman, a man, love's characters, the myth their own. We are agreed. The moon is low, its silent flame across the garden of roses, almost level with the harbor. We place our hands on the silence and once again repeat the vow.
Once again, by Lawrence Joseph, from his selected poems, Certain Clarity, just out from Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Thanks to Farrar, Straus and Giroux, the publisher, to McNally Jackson, which was to host our event. And thank you very much to all who joined, and to Georgetown and the Berkley Center for hosting this event. Our next event on May 26th will have to do with Pope Francis, the Church in the time of the pandemic, and Francis' pontificate generally. And our guests will be Massimo Fagioli from Villanova University and Christopher Lamb from The Tablet, the English Catholic magazine. The two both have books about Pope Francis just out, and we'll discuss them together with Sean Casey, the director of the Berkley Center. Thanks to all. A special thanks to you, Larry. It's always a pleasure to continue our lifelong conversation. I'm very grateful.